The year is 39 after the birth of Christ. A summer night on Lake Nemi, 20 miles south of Rome. The air smells of burning incense and roasted meat and something else, something sweeter and more disturbing that the slave named Eutychus cannot quite identify. He stands at the stern of the largest ship ever built on an inland lake, a floating palace nearly 250 feet long, its deck covered with gardens and colonnades and fountains that somehow function even on water. Eutychus is 19 years old. He was purchased 6 months ago from a trader who specialized in beautiful youths from the eastern provinces. His duties have been explained to him in terms he did not fully understand at first, but understands now with terrible clarity. Tonight he will serve wine at the emperor's private gathering. He will keep his eyes down. He will respond immediately to any command, and he will never, under any circumstances, speak of what he witnesses to anyone outside this floating world of silk and gold and acts that would be punished by death if committed by anyone except the man who rules the known world. The Emperor Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus reclines on a couch of purple silk at the center of the main deck. The Romans call him Caligula, Little Boot, a childhood nickname from his years in military camps that he now despises but cannot escape. He is 27 years old. He has ruled Rome for 2 years. And in those 2 years, he has transformed the most powerful empire on earth into his personal theater of appetites that recognize no boundaries whatsoever. Eutychus watches from his position near the wine vessels as figures move through torchlight toward the emperor's couch. He recognizes some of them. Senators whose names are spoken with respect in the forum. Women whose families have held power for generations. Priests of temples that are supposed to represent divine virtue. All of them moving toward the emperor with expressions that mix terror and anticipation in equal measure, because refusing an invitation to Caligula's pleasure barge is not survival, but merely delayed execution. What happens next on this floating palace, what Eutychus will witness over the next 7 hours until dawn finally ends the gathering, will be recorded in fragments by historians who lived through this reign. Suetonius will write of it decades later, choosing his words carefully because some acts strain the capacity of language to convey. Cassius Dio will reference events on the lake without describing them fully, noting only that they exceeded even what Rome had learned to expect from its most depraved emperor. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher who visited Rome during Caligula's reign, will describe the emperor as a man who had discovered that absolute power meant absolute freedom to transform every appetite into action. The torches on the pleasure barge flicker as the evening begins. Eutychus grips his wine vessel and prepares to serve. He does not yet know that by morning 3 guests will be dead, 2 by the emperor's direct command, and 1 by their own hand rather than continue participating. He does not know that what he witnesses tonight will haunt him for the remaining 40 years of his life, surfacing in nightmares that will make him cry out in languages he no longer consciously remembers. He does not know that his survival depends entirely on remaining invisible, useful, and silent. What you think you know about Caligula is wrong, not because the stories are exaggerated, because they are incomplete. The tales you have heard, the madness, the cruelty, the horse he supposedly made a senator, these are the stories that survived because they could be told in polite company. The stories that did not survive, the ones that ancient historians referenced but refused to describe in full, the ones that were erased from official records because even Rome had limits on what could be publicly acknowledged, those stories reveal an emperor whose depravity exceeded anything the ancient world had witnessed before or would witness again. Tonight you will learn the 13 most disturbing acts attributed to Caligula by ancient sources, not the familiar tales of political murder and financial excess. The other stories, the ones involving intimate violations that even his enemies struggled to articulate. The ones involving rituals that blended religion and carnality in ways that horrified priests of every faith. The ones involving spectacles designed not merely to entertain, but to demonstrate that the emperor existed beyond all moral constraint. Some of what I am about to tell you was hidden deliberately by ancient authors who feared that explicit description would corrupt their readers. Some was recorded in texts that the early church destroyed because they revealed too clearly what pagan power could become. Some survived only in fragments, in private letters, in graffiti preserved by volcanic ash, in legal documents that mentioned imperial crimes without specifying details. But the evidence exists. Archaeological discoveries in the 20th century confirmed details that historians had dismissed as impossible exaggeration. The pleasure barges themselves were recovered from Lake Nemi, their scale and luxury exceeding even ancient descriptions. Skeletal remains have been found with marks suggesting fates that match the worst of what Suetonius implied. Palace excavations revealed chambers whose purpose becomes clear only when ancient texts are read alongside architectural evidence. Caligula ruled for only 4 years before his own guards murdered him. In those 4 years, he demonstrated what happens when a human being with unlimited power decides that satisfying every appetite is not just possible, but required. He did not simply abuse power. He explored its absolute limits with the systematic curiosity of a man conducting experiments on what pleasure and pain and domination could achieve when nothing prevented their fullest expression. Before we descend into this darkness together, if you value content that reveals the hidden truths of history, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Comment below, telling me where in the world you are listening from. These stories have been buried for 2,000 years. They deserve to be heard by everyone willing to confront what human nature becomes when all restraints are removed. Let us begin with the floating palaces themselves, because what happened on those ships reveals everything about the emperor who built them. You have never seen ships like these. No one alive today has seen ships like these, because they were deliberately sunk after Caligula's death, hidden beneath 40 feet of water for 19 centuries, until Mussolini drained the lake to recover them in the 1930s. The larger vessel measured 240 feet long and 79 feet wide. That is larger than many modern cruise ships. It featured heated floors using the same hypocaust system that warmed Roman baths. It had running water supplied through lead pipes, connected to a pumping system whose engineering still impresses modern naval architects. The deck was covered with marble and gold and mosaic tiles depicting scenes that archaeologists initially refused to publish because of their explicit content. This was not a ship designed for sailing. The lake was only 3 miles across. This was a ship designed for hosting gatherings, where what happened needed to remain invisible from shore. A ship designed for activities that could not occur in palaces where servants might talk. A ship where the emperor could indulge appetites that even Rome, tolerant Rome, decadent Rome, would struggle to accept. Ancient sources describe what happened on these vessels in terms that require careful reading. Suetonius writes that Caligula hosted gatherings featuring the wives and husbands of senators who were required to attend and required to participate in whatever the emperor demanded. He writes that the emperor would inspect guests upon arrival, lifting chins to examine faces, commenting on physical attributes with the casual expertise of a livestock buyer at market. What Suetonius does not write explicitly, but what his contemporary readers understood, was that these inspections determined assignments for the evening's activities. The emperor selected partners for himself and for others. He arranged combinations. He commanded specific acts and observed their completion. Refusal meant immediate consequences that ranged from social destruction to physical harm to death. A senator named Valerius Catullus attended one such gathering in 38 and was commanded to participate in acts with partners, not of his choosing. When he attempted to excuse himself by claiming illness, Caligula had physicians examine him on the deck in front of all assembled guests. When the physicians found nothing wrong, Catullus was informed that his reluctance itself was a crime against the emperor's hospitality. What followed was described by Suetonius only as appropriate punishment for ingratitude. Catullus survived the night but killed himself within the week. His family's property was seized by the imperial treasury. His wife was summoned to subsequent gatherings without him. The ships featured private chambers below deck, whose dimensions suggest specific purposes. Rooms barely large enough for a single couch. Rooms with unusual fixtures mounted on walls. Rooms whose floors sloped toward drains in ways that naval architects found inexplicable, until historians suggested that easy cleaning was the design priority. When the ships were recovered in the 1930s, workers found more than architecture. They found objects, personal items, jewelry torn from settings, fragments of clothing, and, in several locations, human bones that had clearly been deposited long after the ships sank, suggesting that some attendees of Caligula's gatherings never left the vessels alive. The ships burned during World War II, destroyed in a fire that may have been set deliberately by retreating German forces or may have been accidental. Most of what was recovered was lost forever. But enough documentation survived to confirm that Caligula's pleasure barges were exactly what ancient sources claimed, floating stages for imperial appetites that exceeded even Roman tolerance. What happened on those ships was terrible, but what happened in the palace was worse, because it involved people Caligula was supposed to protect. Caligula had 3 sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Livilla. Ancient sources are unanimous that his relationships with all 3 crossed boundaries that even the imperial family's long history of internal marriages could not accommodate. The Romans practiced cousin marriage routinely. They occasionally practiced uncle-niece marriage when political circumstances demanded. But sibling relationships were forbidden absolutely, carrying religious pollution that no ritual could cleanse. These were boundaries that even mad emperors before Caligula had respected. Caligula did not respect them. Suetonius reports that Caligula's relationship with his sister Drusilla began before he became emperor, when they were teenagers living in their grandmother's household. The relationship continued after he took power, becoming increasingly public until Caligula forced Drusilla to divorce her husband and move into the imperial palace in a status that was wife in all but legal name. Drusilla attended state functions at Caligula's side. She was included in imperial oaths, her name spoken alongside the emperor's in a formula that had never before included anyone except the ruler himself. Coins were minted with her image. Temples accepted offerings made in her name. She was, for approximately 18 months, the most powerful woman in the Roman Empire, holding that power through a relationship that Roman law defined as abomination. When Drusilla died in 38, probably of fever, though rumors of other causes circulated, Caligula's reaction exceeded all bounds. He declared her a goddess, the first Roman woman ever officially deified. He made it a capital crime to laugh or bathe or dine with family on the anniversary of her death. He reportedly spent days lying with her corpse before finally permitting burial. A senator named Livius Geminus was executed for reporting that he had seen Drusilla ascending to heaven. Normally, such a report would have been rewarded as evidence of successful deification. But Caligula declared that since Drusilla was already with him, the senator must be lying, and liars who claimed false divine visions deserved death. The surviving sisters, Agrippina and Livilla, fared differently. Caligula continued intimate relationships with both, according to multiple sources, but without the singular obsession he had shown Drusilla. When political circumstances changed, and the sisters were accused of conspiracy, Caligula had them exiled to remote islands where they survived by diving for sponges. Their exile suggests something important. Caligula could have executed them easily. He executed people for far less serious offenses. Instead, he chose humiliation, forcing women of the highest nobility to perform manual labor for survival. The exile was punishment specifically designed to degrade rather than simply end, suggesting that his feelings toward them were complicated in ways that pure hatred would not explain. Agrippina eventually returned from exile after Caligula's death. Her son would become the Emperor Nero, continuing family patterns that the Julio-Claudian dynasty seemed unable to escape. The genetics of imperial power, the concentration of authority in families that married repeatedly within themselves, produce results that modern psychology might have predicted, but ancient Romans could only experience with horror. But Caligula's intimate crimes extended far beyond his own family. What he did to the families of others was, if anything, more disturbing, because it demonstrated that no one in Rome was protected. Caligula was perpetually in need of money. He spent extravagantly, he gave gifts lavishly, he funded construction projects and games that drained the treasury his predecessor had carefully accumulated. Within 2 years of taking power, he had exhausted reserves that should have lasted decades. His solution was creative, in the way that only absolute power permits. Suetonius records that Caligula established a brothel within the imperial palace itself, staffing it with the wives and children of Roman nobility. Families were informed that their members had been selected for service to the emperor. Refusal was not mentioned because refusal was not possible. The selected individuals were installed in palace chambers that had been converted for this specific purpose. Clients were drawn from the Roman elite. Senators, wealthy merchants, foreign dignitaries visiting the capital. They were offered access to partners whose social status would normally make any intimate contact with them impossible and illegal. The fees went directly to the imperial treasury. The emperor personally set prices based on family prestige, physical attributes, and client wealth. A consul's wife commanded the highest fees. A senator's daughter cost somewhat less. Children of knights, the commercial class, were available at rates that even moderately wealthy Romans could afford. The price list, according to sources, was posted publicly at the palace entrance, transforming what should have been the center of Roman government into something more resembling a marketplace for flesh. What made this operation particularly cruel was its requirement of participation. The conscripted individuals were not simply victims. They were required to perform their roles convincingly, to simulate willingness, to satisfy customers in ways that would generate repeat business. Those who failed to generate adequate revenue faced consequences. Those who satisfied customers, too, well faced the emperor's jealousy. A young woman from the patrician Cornelius family supposedly generated exceptional income during her first months of service. Caligula initially praised her success, then grew suspicious that she was enjoying her work too much, then had her publicly flogged and her fees doubled as what he called punishment for excessive enthusiasm. The punishment drew customers eager to see what had made her valuable enough to punish. The additional revenue delighted the emperor. The palace brothel operated for approximately 2 years before Caligula's assassination. Ancient sources suggest that several hundred noble Romans served in it at various times. Most survived physically. The psychological and social damage was permanent. Families who had held honor for generations found themselves contaminated by experiences that could never be fully hidden and never be fully discussed. The brothel's existence was an open secret during Caligula's reign. After his death, the Senate ordered all records destroyed. The chambers were reconverted or demolished. The victims were permitted to return to their families with official pronouncements that nothing had happened, that the rumors were lies, that the previous emperor's excesses had been exaggerated by enemies. But the names were known. The faces were recognized. The noble families of Rome carried invisible marks that everyone could see and no one could mention. What makes this atrocity particularly significant is its systematic nature. This was not impulsive cruelty. This was organized revenue generation, using human beings as product. The emperor had transformed the Roman aristocracy into inventory, to be rented out and returned, maintained and disciplined, valued according to market demand rather than human dignity. But even the palace brothel served practical purposes. What happened in the emperor's private chambers served no purpose except the exploration of appetite itself. When a nobleman married in Rome during Caligula's reign, the wedding announcement went to the imperial palace before it went anywhere else. This was not custom, this was requirement. Because Caligula had established a practice that made every wedding in Rome subject to his personal inspection and potential intervention. The practice worked like this. Upon receiving notice of an upcoming marriage, the emperor would decide whether to attend. If he attended, the wedding proceeded normally until the moment when bride and groom would traditionally retire to consummate their union. At that moment, Caligula would sometimes exercise what he called the rite of first night, taking the bride himself before the groom could touch her. This was not legend. This was documented by multiple ancient sources with specific examples. Gaius Piso married a woman named Livia Orestilla in 37. Caligula attended the wedding, watched the ceremony, participated in the feast, and then announced that he found the bride appealing. He took her from the banquet hall that night. When Piso protested, Caligula divorced them by imperial decree and married Livia Orestilla himself. The marriage lasted approximately 2 months before Caligula divorced her and banished her from Rome, forbidding her from intimate relations with any man for the rest of her life. Lollia Paulina's wedding followed a similar pattern. She was married to a provincial governor named Gaius Memmius Regulus. Caligula heard reports of her beauty from soldiers returning from the provinces. He summoned her to Rome, divorced her from her husband by decree, married her himself, and discarded her within the year, again with prohibitions on future relationships. The practice served multiple purposes beyond personal gratification. It demonstrated that no family relationship in Rome was secure against imperial desire. It created terror among the nobility that made political opposition nearly impossible. It generated revenue because families who wished to avoid imperial attention at weddings learned to pay substantial bribes to palace officials who controlled the emperor's calendar. But the weddings that Caligula attended were only the visible portion of the system. The less visible portion operated through the palace itself, where Caligula established something that ancient sources struggle to describe in direct terms. What comes next was the most systematic of Caligula's intimate crimes, an operation that transformed the imperial household into something that had never existed before in Rome. Caligula declared himself a living god. This is one of the famous facts about his reign, usually presented as evidence of madness. But the declaration had practical applications that ancient sources describe with evident discomfort. If the emperor was divine, then physical union with the emperor was religious experience. If the emperor was Jupiter in human form, then serving his physical needs was worship. If the emperor was a god, then anything he demanded was by definition sacred, regardless of how ordinary morality might classify it. Caligula constructed a temple to himself within the palace complex. The temple featured a golden statue of himself that was dressed daily in clothing identical to what he wore, so that worshippers would see the god and the emperor as identical. The temple accepted offerings and conducted rituals and employed priests whose duties extended beyond conventional religious service. Ancient sources describe ceremonies in which selected participants were required to worship the divine emperor physically. The ceremonies blended religious ritual with intimate acts in ways that even Rome's tolerant religious culture found disturbing. Participants were prepared through purification rituals, borrowed from legitimate cults, dressed in ceremonial clothing, led through processions, and finally brought to the divine presence for what was termed sacred union. The religious framing served legal purposes. Acts that would be crimes under Roman law became protected as religious practice. Participants who might otherwise refuse or resist were manipulated through religious conditioning to accept what they would not have accepted as simple imperial command. The sacred context transformed violation into honor, at least officially. A priest from the Temple of Vesta, a virgin dedicated to Rome's sacred flame, was reportedly brought to the divine bedroom for what Caligula called her true consecration. The Vestal virgins were among Rome's most sacred religious figures. Their virginity was legally protected by death penalty for any man who violated it. Caligula circumvented this protection by declaring that, as a god himself, union with him did not violate her sacred status, but rather elevated it. The Vestal survived the experience and was returned to her temple. What happened to her psychologically, spiritually, and within her religious community was not recorded. The incident was officially denied immediately and has been doubted by some historians as too outrageous even for Caligula. But Suetonius records it, and Suetonius had access to sources who lived through the reign and had no obvious motive to invent additional crimes for an emperor whose documented acts were already monstrous. The divine bedroom operated according to its own logic. There, the emperor's desires were religious commandments. Obedience was worship. Resistance was blasphemy. And the line between imperial power and divine power disappeared entirely, leaving participants with no framework for refusal, no language for objection, no category of experience that matched what they endured. What makes this atrocity significant is its theological creativity. Caligula did not merely abuse power. He redesigned religious concepts to serve his appetites. He invented a theology of domination that transformed violation into veneration. He demonstrated that absolute power could remake meaning itself, could define any act as sacred simply by declaring it so. But the divine bedroom served the emperor's private appetites. What happened in public spaces served purposes that extended beyond personal gratification into political control through shared trauma. Caligula hosted banquets that ancient sources describe as tests of loyalty expressed through willingness to endure degradation. Attendance was mandatory for anyone the emperor invited. And what occurred at these gatherings was designed to break the pride of Rome's most powerful families. The format varied, but certain elements recurred. Guests arrived in their finest clothing and were immediately required to change into costumes selected by the emperor. Sometimes the costumes were designed for humiliation, forcing dignified senators to dress as animals or servants or worse. Sometimes the costumes were designed to expose, leaving guests effectively unclothed while the emperor remained fully dressed. Dinner itself was orchestrated to create discomfort. Guests might find themselves served elaborately while the person beside them received nothing, creating guilt and fear in equal measure. Or everyone might receive identical servings of inedible food while the emperor consumed delicacies, demonstrating the difference between his status and theirs. Or the food might be excellent, but the seating might place husbands next to the emperor while their wives were positioned elsewhere, beyond sight, and potentially beyond protection. A senator named Lucius Vitellius attended one such banquet and was commanded to remove his wife's clothing himself, garment by garment, while the emperor watched and commented. The removal was to be performed as worship, the senator physically demonstrating his acceptance that the emperor had the right to see whatever he wished to see. Vitellius complied. His compliance earned the emperor's temporary favor. His marriage did not survive the evening. Another banquet featured what sources call the lottery of partners. Guests drew tokens that determined with whom they would spend the evening's final hours. The pairings were random, except when they were not. The emperor occasionally intervened to create combinations designed for maximum psychological impact. Husbands assigned to other men's wives. Political rivals assigned to each other. Combinations that violated social rules so thoroughly that participants could never afterward look at each other without remembering. The genius of these banquets, if that word can be applied to such cruelty, was that they made victims complicit in their own degradation. No one was simply subjected to these experiences. Everyone participated. Everyone performed acts that they would never have performed otherwise. Everyone emerged with memories of what they had done, not merely what had been done to them. This complicity served political purposes. Senators who had shared experiences at imperial banquets could not easily organize against the emperor without confronting what they had participated in together. The shared shame became a kind of bond, uniting them not in opposition, but in desperate mutual silence. Conspiracy requires trust, and trust cannot exist among people who have seen each other at their worst. The banquets continued throughout Caligula's reign, becoming increasingly elaborate in their cruelties. What began as uncomfortable dinner parties evolved into extended events lasting days, during which participants were kept in the palace without ability to leave, subject to whatever the emperor's mood suggested at any hour. Some participants did not survive. Deaths at imperial banquets were attributed to illness, to accident, to divine displeasure. The reality that some guests simply could not endure what was demanded of them was never officially acknowledged. But banquets affected only those powerful enough to warrant imperial attention. What Caligula did in the arena affected the entire population of Rome. The games that Caligula sponsored in Rome's arenas included elements that exceeded even Roman tolerance for violence and transgression. The Romans were not squeamish about bloodshed. They watched gladiators kill each other as entertainment. They watched condemned criminals torn apart by animals. They accepted levels of public violence that modern sensibilities find incomprehensible. Caligula found these traditional spectacles insufficient. Ancient sources describe arena events that combined violence with intimate violation in ways that serve no purpose except demonstrating that no boundary was beyond the emperor's power to cross. Condemned criminals faced not simply death, but degradation before death, their final moments staged as performances of humiliation that even hardened Roman crowds found difficult to watch. Suetonius provides specific examples without explicit description, referring to acts that were performed upon prisoners before their executions in phrases that ancient readers understood, but modern readers must decode. The staging involved mythological themes. Criminals were forced to enact stories from mythology that involved transformation, violation, or both. The god Jupiter transforming himself to access mortal women, Pasiphae and the bull, Leda and the swan. These mythological reenactments used real condemned prisoners and real situations that mythology had only imagined. The performances were not symbolic. They were literal, achieved through stage engineering and trained animals and arrangements that modern historians initially dismissed as impossible until archaeological evidence suggested otherwise. A historian named Martial, writing decades later, references arena spectacles in which mythological scenes were staged with full physical reality. He refers to this as a tradition established by certain emperors without naming names. But the timeline and descriptions point clearly to Caligula's reign as the origin of these particular entertainments. The arena spectacles served political purposes beyond entertainment. They demonstrated that the emperor could command anything, that even the line between human and animal could be crossed at imperial direction. They created spectacles so extreme that ordinary violence seemed mild by comparison, recalibrating Roman expectations about what power could demand. They also served to implicate the audience. Tens of thousands of Roman citizens watched these spectacles. They did not merely tolerate them. They cheered. They attended voluntarily. They made themselves witnesses to and participants in whatever the emperor staged. The collective nature of arena attendance meant that Rome as a whole became complicit in what individual Romans might privately find horrifying. A philosopher named Seneca wrote about arena attendance in terms that suggest deep ambivalence. He describes the crowd's enthusiasm for blood, their disappointment when executions were too swift, their demand for spectacles that satisfied appetites they did not want to acknowledge. He was writing about later emperors, but the crowds he described were crowds that Caligula had trained through 4 years of escalating extremity. What Caligula discovered about spectacles was that escalation was required to maintain impact. Each event had to exceed its predecessors. Each innovation became normalized and required further innovation to produce the same effect. The arena became a laboratory for testing limits, finding them, and then exceeding them in ways that would find the next limit. This discovery about escalation applies to everything Caligula did. His appetites did not remain static. They grew. and their growth required constantly new targets, new victims, new combinations of excess. Which brings us to what happened to those who served him most closely and most intimately. Caligula had favorites. Men and women who enjoyed his particular attention, who benefited from his protection and generosity, who served his intimate needs, and received rewards that others could only envy. Ancient sources name several of these individuals and describe their fates. The actor Mnestor was one such favorite. He was famous throughout Rome for his performances and for his physical beauty. Caligula became obsessed with him, attending every performance, commanding private audiences, showering him with gifts that exceeded what most senators possessed. The relationship between emperor and actor was public and acknowledged. Caligula would kiss Mnestor openly in the theater. He would punish anyone who made noise during Nestor's performances, reportedly ordering executions for coughing during particularly sensitive scenes. He commissioned artworks, depicting himself and Mnestor together, in poses that left no ambiguity about the nature of their relationship. But Caligula's favor was as dangerous as his displeasure. Mnestor was required to be available at all times for whatever the emperor desired. His career as an actor continued, but his primary profession became serving the emperor's needs, regardless of personal cost. He survived Caligula's reign only because the assassination came before the emperor tired of him, the fate that befell most of those who attracted imperial attention. A former slave named Caesonia became Caligula's final wife and apparent favorite among his female companions. Ancient sources describe her as neither young nor beautiful by conventional standards, which led to speculation about what attracted the emperor to her specifically. Suetonius suggests that she possessed knowledge of pharmaceuticals that could influence desire, that she had effectively drugged the emperor into obsession. Whether this pharmaceutical explanation is accurate, the relationship between Caligula and Caesonia was notable for its intensity and its public nature. He displayed her naked to guests at banquets. He brought her to military camps and paraded her before soldiers in military regalia, a combination of exposure and costume that combined vulnerability with power in ways that seemed designed to confuse observers. Caesonia bore Caligula a daughter and seemed to gain influence through this connection, but her influence did not protect her when the emperor was assassinated. The guards who killed Caligula killed Caesonia as well, and killed their infant daughter by smashing her head against a wall. The thoroughness of the assassination suggests that those closest to the emperor were considered contaminated by proximity, unfit to survive even as innocent children. The favorites illustrate a pattern that runs throughout Caligula's reign. Those who served him most closely faced risks that exceeded those facing his enemies. Enemies could maintain distance, favorites could not. They were exposed to appetites that did not diminish with satisfaction, but grew with indulgence. They were required to participate in escalating demands, whose endpoints were unpredictable and often fatal. The young slave Eutychus, whom I mentioned at the beginning of this account, was one such favorite for a brief period. Ancient sources do not record his specific fate, but they record the general fate of beautiful young slaves who attracted imperial attention. Most did not survive the full term of Caligula's reign. Those who did often wished they had not. But not all of Caligula's intimate crimes targeted humans. What he did with his horse reveals something perhaps more disturbing about the psychology of absolute power. You have heard that Caligula planned to make his horse a consul. This story appears in virtually every account of his reign, usually presented as evidence of madness or of contempt for the Senate. But the full account of Caligula and his horse in Incitatus reveals something stranger than simple madness. Incitatus lived in the palace, in quarters that exceeded what most senators enjoyed. The horse had a marble stable. He had a collar of precious gems. He had servants assigned specifically to ensure his comfort and to maintain silence in his vicinity so that his sleep would not be disturbed. He received dinner invitations issued in his own name to gatherings where he would be present alongside Rome's most powerful families. The surface reading of these arrangements is that Caligula was mocking the Senate by treating a horse with dignity he denied to humans. This reading is probably partially correct. But Suetonius adds details that suggest something more complex. The emperor would spend hours alone with the horse. He would conduct conversations with incitatus, as though the animal understood and responded. He would sometimes cancel human audiences because he wished to spend time with his horse instead. The relationship between emperor and animal exceeded even Roman tolerance for pet affection, moving into territory that observers found difficult to categorize. Some historians have suggested that the relationship between Caligula and Incitatus was intimate in ways that ancient sources chose not to articulate directly. The evidence is circumstantial but consistent. The private time alone, the elaborate quarters within the palace, the jealousy the emperor displayed when others paid attention to the horse, the positioning of the animal in situations where human companions would normally appear. Whether or not this interpretation is correct, the Incitatus situation demonstrates something important about absolute power. The emperor could elevate an animal to quasi-human status and require everyone to pretend this was normal. He could create an alternate reality in which a horse deserved consulship and enforce that reality through power alone. The Senate's response to the threatened horse consul appointment was not laughter but terrified acquiescence. The power to define reality is the ultimate power. The power to declare that a horse is worthy of honor and to punish anyone who disagrees demonstrates that truth itself becomes subject to imperial control. What Caligula did with Incitatus was not merely eccentric. It was a test of how far reality could be bent before it broke. Reality did eventually break, but not before Caligula pushed it further than anyone thought possible. The Romans did not practice human sacrifice. This was a point of pride that distinguished them from what they considered barbarian cultures. The practice had been officially abolished for centuries. Conducting human sacrifice in Rome carried the death penalty and religious pollution that contaminated the entire community. Caligula practiced human sacrifice. The evidence is fragmentary, but consistent across multiple sources. He conducted private rituals in palace chambers that involved killing slaves in ceremonial contexts. He blended religious elements from Egyptian, Eastern, and invented traditions to create ceremonies that served his needs. He may have believed these sacrifices actually accomplished something spiritual, or he may simply have enjoyed the ultimate demonstration of power over life and death staged in religious frameworks. A source, named Philo of Alexandria, describes rituals in which victims were costumed as divine figures before being killed. The deaths were not simply executions, but performances, staged according to specific scripts that Caligula himself composed. The victims were required to speak particular words, to make particular gestures, to die in particular positions that the emperor had designed. The religious content of these ceremonies appears to have focused on the emperor's own divinity. Sacrifices were offered to Caligula himself, as Jupiter incarnate, as a living god whose appetites required the ultimate form of offering. The victims were transformed through ritual into gifts to the divine emperor, their deaths completing a theological circuit that positioned Caligula as the proper recipient of human life. How many died in these ceremonies cannot be determined. Ancient sources suggest dozens at minimum, possibly hundreds over the course of the reign. The victims were primarily slaves whose deaths required no legal accountability, though some sources suggest that prisoners condemned to death were diverted from standard execution to private sacrifice when the emperor required offerings. The sacrificial rituals apparently took place in chambers specially constructed for the purpose. After Caligula's death, these chambers were discovered and destroyed, their contents burned, their existence officially denied. But descriptions survived in sources hostile to the subsequent imperial dynasty. who used the sacrifices as evidence of Claudius's guilt by association. The theological creativity that characterized Caligula's other intimate crimes appears in these sacrifices as well. He did not simply kill. He created elaborate frameworks of meaning around killing. He invented religions that justified whatever he wished to do. He demonstrated that even the Roman horror of human sacrifice could be overcome if someone with sufficient power simply decided to overcome it. This creativity extended to his tortures as well, which brings us to the private punishments that ancient sources found almost impossible to describe. Caligula personally attended torture sessions. This was unusual even for emperors who used torture freely. Most delegated the actual infliction of pain to specialists. Caligula wanted to watch. Sometimes he wanted to participate. The emperor developed what sources call a particular interest in torture methods that combined pain with intimate violation. Standard Roman torture focused on extracting information through physical suffering. Caligula's innovations focused on creating experiences that damaged victims psychologically rather than simply physically, that violated their sense of self rather than merely their bodies. Suetonius writes that the emperor was fond of having victims tortured in front of their family members, particularly spouses. The witnessing was considered part of the punishment for both victim and witnesses. Husbands were forced to watch what was done to their wives. Parents were forced to watch what was done to their children. The torture itself was less important than the destruction of family bonds that occurred when intimacy was transformed into spectacle. The emperor reportedly experimented with torture methods that exploited intimate anatomy. The details in ancient sources are vague, perhaps deliberately, but suggest that Caligula developed techniques that targeted areas of the body associated with pleasure and forced them to produce pain. The transformation of pleasure, associated sensation into agony, was apparently a specific interest, explored through what can only be called experimentation on living subjects. A man named Sextus Papinius was tortured for allegedly conspiring against the emperor. Standard torture would have focused on extracting names of other conspirators. Caligula's torture focused on something else entirely. The sessions lasted weeks. Family members were brought in to witness. The nature of what was done was not recorded explicitly, but Sextus reportedly begged for death repeatedly and was refused. When he finally died, the emperor expressed disappointment that the entertainment had ended. The private punishments were conducted in palace chambers that were soundproofed through construction techniques that impressed later architects who examined the ruins. The chambers could contain whatever sounds occurred within them. They were designed for screaming. What makes these tortures significant is not their cruelty alone. The Roman world was cruel. What makes them significant is their intimacy. The emperor personally observing, personally participating, personally designing experiences that served no practical purpose except the satisfaction of appetites that found pleasure in others' destruction. But Caligula's most disturbing, intimate crime may have been reserved for his final night alive. Before we reach the final atrocity, we must discuss how Caligula transformed state executions into personal entertainment with intimate dimensions. Roman execution was normally public, but relatively swift. Criminals were beheaded, strangled, thrown from cliffs, or exposed to animals. The deaths served public purposes of deterrence and justice. They were not designed primarily for the personal enjoyment of specific spectators. Caligula converted executions into private performances staged for his personal pleasure. Condemned prisoners were not simply killed, but were prepared, costumed, and directed through deaths that followed scripts the emperor had written. The scripts frequently involved intimate elements that transformed dying into a form of violation. A condemned man might be required to perform acts on himself or others before being allowed to die. A condemned woman might be subjected to specific experiences that Caligula wished to observe before her sentence was carried out. The deaths themselves might be staged in ways that emphasized vulnerability and exposure. Suetonius provides one specific example that can be discussed without explicit detail. A father and son were condemned together for conspiracy. Caligula directed their executions to occur simultaneously, arranged so that each could watch the other die. But before the deaths, both were required to perform acts of mutual humiliation that violated the relationship between parent and child. The emperor watched the entire sequence, from humiliation through death, and reportedly expressed satisfaction at the emotional destruction achieved before physical destruction occurred. The conversion of execution into intimate theater served the emperor's needs in ways that simple killing could not. Death ended suffering. What Caligula wanted was suffering that exceeded death, that violated victims in dimensions beyond physical existence. The intimate staging achieved this by attacking relationships, identities, and dignities that physical pain alone could not reach. Guards who participated in these execution performances sometimes appeared in later records as disturbed men who sought religious purification for what they had witnessed and facilitated. The trauma extended beyond victims to those required to serve as instruments. The entire apparatus of imperial punishment became contaminated by intimate horror that standard violence could not have produced. Now we reach the 13th and final atrocity. What happened on Caligula's last night alive, January 24th, 41 years after the birth of Christ. The Palatine Games are underway, theatrical performances honoring the divine Augustus. Tomorrow, Caligula will attend the theater and be murdered by his own guards. Tonight, he hosts a final private gathering in the palace. What happened at this gathering is recorded in fragments across multiple sources. The details do not fully align, suggesting either that witnesses disagreed or that some details were too disturbing to record consistently. But the outline is clear enough. The gathering included close associates of the emperor, those who had survived in his favor through 4 years of escalating demands. It included slaves and servants selected for specific attributes. It included, according to some sources, individuals who were brought from the prison cells beneath the palace to serve as entertainments who would not return to their cells afterward. The gathering began in early evening and continued past midnight. Food was served, wine flowed, and then the emperor announced that he was celebrating. He had received omens, he said, signs that his reign would last another 30 years, signs that he would achieve things that even Jupiter had not achieved, signs that this night marked the beginning of a new phase of his divinity. The celebration of these omens required appropriate observance. What followed was described by witnesses as exceeding anything they had experienced at previous gatherings. The emperor seemed driven to push beyond limits that had previously constrained even him. He demanded combinations that had not been demanded before. He orchestrated scenes that blurred the line between pleasure and violence more completely than ever. He killed at least one person during the gathering itself, reportedly while in the midst of acts that sources do not describe explicitly. By the time dawn approached, the emperor had exhausted himself and retired to his quarters. The surviving guests were released, some wounded, some traumatized beyond the capacity for speech, some simply absent because they had not survived the night's entertainment. Hours later, Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, struck the first blow as Caligula walked through a passage toward the theater. Other guards joined in. The emperor reportedly asked if he was really dying, as though the experience was too novel to immediately comprehend. He died on the floor of a palace corridor, his blood mixing with dust. The guards who killed him had specific grievances. Chaerea had been repeatedly humiliated by the emperor, mocked for what Caligula perceived as effeminate characteristics. Other conspirators had suffered their own indignities. But the assassination was not simply revenge for individual grievances. It was the accumulated response to 4 years of intimate crimes that had contaminated everyone they touched. The Senate declared Caligula a public enemy. His statues were torn down, His name was removed from monuments. His memory was officially condemned. The succeeding emperor, Claudius, presented himself as restoring normalcy after an aberration. But Caligula was not an aberration. He was an exploration, an experiment in what absolute power could become when wielded by someone with no internal limits and no external constraints. He discovered answers that Rome wished it did not know. You have now heard accounts of 13 categories of intimate atrocity attributed to Caligula by ancient sources. The question that remains is how much of this we should believe. Ancient historians were not objective journalists. They wrote with political purposes, often decades after events, using sources that were themselves politically motivated. Suetonius, in particular, drew on palace gossip and senatorial propaganda that may have exaggerated imperial crimes for various reasons. But several factors suggest that the core accounts are accurate, even if specific details may be embellished. First, the sources are multiple and independent. Suetonius, Cassius, Dio, Philo of Alexandria, and others all describe similar patterns of behavior. They do not merely copy each other, but provide overlapping accounts with different details that suggest access to different witnesses. The convergence of independent sources on similar themes suggests underlying truth. Second, the archaeological evidence confirms unexpected details. The pleasure barges were real and exceeded ancient descriptions in their scale and luxury. Palace chambers that match descriptions of torture facilities have been excavated. The infrastructure for Caligula's crimes existed as sources claimed. Third, the reactions of contemporaries were consistent with the accounts. The assassination was conducted by guards who had served closely with the emperor and who explicitly cited his behavior as motivation. The Senate's immediate condemnation of his memory suggests genuine relief rather than political theater. People who lived through the reign responded as though the accounts were accurate. Fourth, the psychological portrait is coherent. Caligula's behavior follows recognizable patterns that modern psychology would identify as particular personality disorders. The escalation, the intimate focus on power demonstration, the creative cruelty, the apparent inability to experience satisfaction, all these elements form a consistent picture that would be difficult to fabricate from imagination alone. What ancient sources describe is an emperor who discovered that absolute power meant absolute freedom to explore appetites without limit. He did not simply indulge existing desires. He experimented with desire itself, pushing boundaries to find where they were and then pushing further. He used intimate violation as a tool of political control, destroying the dignity and privacy and autonomy of Rome's elite in ways that made political opposition psychologically impossible. The result was a reign that lasted only 4 years, but that demonstrated something permanent about human nature and political power. Any system that concentrates authority without accountability creates the possibility of a Caligula. The specific appetites may vary. The underlying dynamic, power exploring its own limits, remains constant. Why does this matter 2,000 years later? The patterns Caligula exemplified did not end with his assassination. Throughout history, rulers with absolute power have committed similar crimes. The specific methods vary by culture and technology, but the underlying dynamics persist. The combination of intimate violation with political control appears repeatedly in authoritarian regimes. The use of sexual humiliation to break resistance. The conversion of state apparatus into machinery for personal gratification. The creation of complicity through forced participation in crimes. These techniques were not invented by Caligula and were not buried with him. Modern psychological research has identified characteristics that predict dangerous behavior when combined with power, lack of empathy, grandiosity, stimulus seeking that requires constant escalation, tendency to view others as objects rather than persons. These characteristics appear across history in figures who caused enormous harm when they achieved positions of authority. The pleasure barges of Lake Nemi have their modern equivalents: private islands, private planes, private parties, where the powerful gather beyond public observation. The technology changes. The tendency of power to seek spaces where it can operate without accountability remains constant. Understanding Caligula helps us recognize warning signs. Leaders who demand personal loyalty, tests that require degradation. Leaders who blur the line between their personal desires and official policy. Leaders who create systems of complicity that bind followers through shared transgression. These patterns have appeared throughout history and continue appearing today. The Roman response to Caligula is also instructive. The guards who killed him had served him for years, participating in his crimes, enabling his appetites. Their willingness to eventually act suggests that even deep complicity can reach limits. But it took 4 years and countless victims before those limits were reached. How much damage occurs before limits are reached depends on institutional structures. Rome had few checks on imperial power. The guards acted from personal grievance rather than systematic constraint. Systems designed with accountability, with institutional rather than personal checks on power, reduce the damage that any individual can inflict before being stopped. The stories of Caligula's victims have largely been lost. We know names of some senators, some nobility, some of those elevated enough that their suffering was recorded. But the slaves on the pleasure barges, the prisoners in the torture chambers, the countless unnamed individuals who served or suffered or died during the 4-year reign, they remain invisible in historical record. This invisibility is itself a lesson. Power structures protect their own records. The experiences of the powerless are erased unless someone specifically preserves them. What we know about Caligula comes primarily from elite sources describing elite victims. The full scope of damage to those without advocates to record their suffering cannot be measured. We began on Lake Nemi with a 19-year-old slave named Eutychus serving wine at an imperial gathering, knowing that his survival depended on remaining silent about whatever he witnessed. We have traveled through 13 categories of intimate atrocity that define the worst of what imperial Rome produced. What should we take from this journey? First, that human capacity for cruelty is real and enduring. Caligula was not uniquely evil. He was a person with particular psychological characteristics, placed in a position where those characteristics could express themselves without constraint. Similar people exist in every generation. Similar atrocities occur whenever such people achieve positions of absolute power. Second, that intimate violation serves power in ways that simple violence cannot. The destruction of privacy, dignity, and bodily autonomy breaks resistance more effectively than physical pain alone. Caligula discovered this through experimentation. Others have rediscovered it throughout history. The techniques appear in torture manuals and authoritarian playbooks across cultures and centuries. Third, that escalation is inherent in unchecked power. Caligula did not begin his reign with pleasure barges and human sacrifice. He arrived at these extremes through progressive steps, each excess requiring greater excess to produce the same effect. Any system that permits initial transgressions without consequence creates pressure toward escalating transgressions. Fourth, that complicity binds more effectively than force. The senators who attended Caligula's banquets were not physically imprisoned. They could have refused. But refusal meant destruction, and participation meant contamination that made subsequent resistance psychologically impossible. Systems of power that create complicity in their own crimes become self-perpetuating through the very mechanisms that make them horrific. Fifth, that memory matters. The stories of what Caligula did were preserved despite efforts to destroy them. That preservation serves as warning. When atrocities are hidden, erased, denied, they become easier to repeat. When they are remembered, they become harder to commit because potential perpetrators know that history will record their crimes. The young slave Eutychus, if he survived, would have carried memories of Lake Nemi for the rest of his life. He would have known things he could never share, witnessed things that no language could adequately describe, understood through personal experience what power without limit becomes. We do not have his testimony directly, but we have enough testimony from others to reconstruct something of what he experienced. And in that reconstruction, in the effort to understand what happened in those torchlit nights on floating palaces, we perform an act of witness that history requires. Caligula has been dead for nearly 2,000 years. The patterns he exemplified remain alive. Recognizing those patterns, in their ancient forms and their modern manifestations, is how we honor his victims and protect potential future victims from those who would follow his example. The emperor's body was burned hastily after his assassination. His ashes were scattered. No tomb was built. His successors tried to ensure that nothing remained. But something did remain. The accounts, the evidence, the lessons, the warning. That warning echoes across 20 centuries to reach us tonight. If you found this exploration of history's darkness valuable, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you will not miss future investigations into the hidden truths of the past. Share this video with anyone who thinks they understand what absolute power becomes when held by those without conscience or constraint. Comment below, telling me what other historical figures you want examined in this depth. What other atrocities have been hidden behind comfortable legends? What other patterns of power and violation deserve exposure? These stories matter because understanding them helps us recognize their modern echoes. These victims matter because forgetting them enables repetition of their suffering. And these patterns matter because they persist in recognizable forms wherever power concentrates without accountability. Caligula ruled Rome for 4 years. In that time, he demonstrated everything that human nature is capable of when nothing prevents its darkest expressions. The demonstration cost countless lives and damaged countless more. Let his reign serve as the warning it was preserved to be. See you in the next video, where we will continue uncovering the buried truths that reveal what power does when nothing and no one can stop it.